So we all know those games that graphically pushed that console to its limits, you know, like graphically for its time was amazing, for that specific console was like, just blew you away. So today I just want to talk about some games for a specific console that really pushed it to its limits. So we're going to start with the NES. I'm going to start from the beginning, you know, classic. We're going to say Kirby's Adventure. Most people never even really played Kirby's Adventure at the time, because it kind of came out late in the life cycle of the NES in, I think, 1993. And it's just the use of color was different. It was unique. It was unlike anything other on the NES, but really what was more appealing was how smooth it played. It also had the largest capacity storage for an NES game. It had 6 MB. And what made that game so special and different was you can transform into anything. All of your enemies, you can turn into them, which was really cool. You could fly, you could jump, you know, the bosses were pretty easy. But some honorable mentions for the NES is Battletoads and Contra. The next system is the Sega Master System. Now, and here in the US, Sega Master System really wasn't as popular as how it was overseas, or in the UK, I believe it was really popular. But the game I'm gonna go with is Phantasy Star. It was an exclusive for the Sega Master System, and it was a prime example of the graphical powers of the system. The game maxed out at 4 MB, which included image-based cutscenes along with the top-down viewpoint of the 80s. Whenever dialogue appeared in the game, it was accompanied by a close-view pop-up that showed off the in-depth detail of the characters. It was the battles and hidden treasures, which had you navigating 3D-like mazes, which was super cool. That was all the craze back then. 1987 was pure sorcery. In 1987, that was really ahead of its time, and it really pushed the limits of that console. Some honorable mentions is Outrun and Afterburner. The next console, Sega Genesis. The game that really pushed it to its limits was Vector Man. The fact that Vector Man even made it to the Genesis is pretty remarkable if you ask me. The pre-rendered 3D models and multi-layered backdrops should just simply not have been possible on this console. But in '95, they somehow managed it. The lighting effects were extraordinary with animation we only expected on the next generation of consoles. Come on, this is '95. Each limb of Vector Man animated independently with flags and the fluttering in the wind. Considering that there were massive explosions and enormous boss fights, it's quite surprising that everything ran smoothly without a bit of lag. Honorable mentions, Gunstar Heroes, Rocket Knight Adventures. The next console we're talking about, you guessed it, Super Nintendo. What game, you might ask? I think you might know. Star Fox. Nintendo has always been keen on innovation, and when it comes to their hardware, and when it comes to its software, they've shown the competition how it's done. Star Fox launched in 1993 as a complete 3-dimensional on-rail shooter. I mean, just look at it. There were no sprites to be seen anywhere, as it was pushing out polygons using an onboard Super FX chip. By today's standards, the 3D looks pretty, you know, whatever. But back then, this was mind-blowing. It might not be the best game we've ever played on the SNES, but it's the game that paved the way for future consoles and exceeded the original strength of the Super Nintendo. Honorable mentions, Donkey Kong Country and Super Mario RPG. The next console, Sega Saturn. The game that pushed its limits, Panzer Dragoon. What we have here is an on-rail shooter atop a Blue Dragon. It's become a cult classic that's very hard to track down, but also one of the only games to truly show what the Sega Saturn was capable of in the right hands. The Sega Saturn was really only capable of really good-looking 2D games or 2.5D games, but what's more surprising is that it was a Sega Saturn launch game, which in effect means it never improved much since launch. Effects such as real-time reflections in water and a decent frame rate was a huge technical achievement on a console that really didn't have anywhere near as much power as any of its rivals. Honorable mentions, Sega Rally, Burning Rangers. The next console, the original PlayStation. The game that pushed its limits, Metal Gear Solid. It was a game that brought a new genre really to light, and that was stealth. And it had you literally interacting with the hardware of your console, which was already pushing the boundaries. Metal Gear Solid was one of the first games to use in-game cinematics, now common practice, to tell a story. It was originally developed using blocks of Lego, believe it or not, and it really pushed the limits of the PS1. Loading scenes had to be fast between areas as timing was always of the essence. Then there was the massive Metal Gear Rex you had to fight at the end. Before this, there was just simply no production value to match it. Honorable mentions: Gran Turismo 2, Final Fantasy VII. The next console, the N64. And the game that pushed its limits, Perfect Dark. It's a well-known fact that the N64's GoldenEye made first-person shooter games pretty much a normality on consoles. The N64 was, after all, the first console to come packed with a controller that hosted an analog stick. Yes, just one stick. And Perfect Dark took full advantage of it. More so, if you had two controllers. You could plug one controller into port 1 and the other into port 3 and have yourself a dual analog setup. You'd also have to upgrade the RAM on your console for it to keep the frame rate up to speed, as the graphics sucked the system dry. This title also used in-game cutscenes to tell the story. Honorable mentions: Conker's Bad Fur Day and The Legend of Zelda Majora's Mask. The next console, Sega Dreamcast. The game that pushed its limits, Soul Calibur. Soul Calibur was a sequel to Soul Blade on the PlayStation. At the time, this was pure perfection of tight controls, graphics, stage design, and overall enjoyment. What makes it ironic though is that it was a launch title and looked better than most of the launch titles on the PS2 that followed. There were few titles that came close, but never quite matched the quality of the fighter. Where it impressed the most was the animation of the models. Honorable mentions: Shenmue 2 and Echo the Dragon Defender of the Future. So for our next console, the PS2, I'm gonna have to go with Final Fantasy X. And it was a toss-up between that, God of War 2, or maybe Metal Gear Solid 3, or even San Andreas, but that didn't really have to do with graphics. But I go with Final Fantasy X. I mean, look at this. I remember, I think it was, I don't know what grade it was, but I'm pretty sure it was elementary school, and looking at these graphics, it was just mind-blowing. I know it's not the in-game graphics, I know it's the CGI, but even the in-game graphics look good. I mean, just look at this. This is amazing. And not only is this one of the best looking Final Fantasy games, this is in my opinion the best looking game on the PS2. And it was actually the first game in the franchise to even get a direct sequel, so that tells you something. The next console is the GameCube. And the game that really pushed its limits, Resident Evil 4. In 2005, Resident Evil 4 launched exclusively on the GameCube. It was really only exclusive for about a year. You see, Capcom weren't ever that great at keeping promises. What they did promise, and that remained to be the truth, was that it was one of the best looking Resident Evil 4 games of that generation. If you played Resident Evil 4 back then on the PS2 and not GameCube, you simply played the watered down version, which was pretty much me. It took the developers over a year to downscale the PS2 version to match with the inferior architecture of Sony's console. The lighting was dumbed down, several graphic elements such as the leaves on trees vanished. Everything that made Resident Evil 4 so amazing from a visual delight was pretty much removed on the PS2 version. It was that one game that had GameCube owners finally pointing fingers and laughing. Honorable mentions: F-Zero GX, Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. Now the next console is the original Xbox, and this was kind of tough. It was a toss-up between Halo 2 or Half-Life 2 or Ninja Gaiden Black, but I'm gonna go ahead and say Half-Life 2 was that game. Everything just looks absolutely realistic. Great lighting effects, the water effects, great animation, and just the right coat of grit on everything, so it looks so real rather than too shiny or like plastic. It was really ahead of its time. Now the last generation, well, not the last generation, but you know, the 360, Wii, and PS3. For 360, I'm gonna have to go with Halo 4. Despite what you think about this game and how it was rushed and how it didn't have that same feel as Halo 3, a lot of people didn't like the online, blah blah blah. But despite all that, you gotta admit, the improvement from Halo 3 to Halo 4 was amazing. It felt like two different consoles. 343 really pushed the limits on this thing. I mean, just look at it. This is 360 we're talking about, a console that came out in 2005. Not bad for a 9-year-old console. Honorable mentions: Forza Motorsport 4, Grand Theft Auto 5. The next console going with is a Nintendo Wii. Yeah, the Wii didn't have too many gems on that. I mean, in terms of graphics, but I'm gonna have to go ahead and go with Xenoblade. In a generation where JRPGs received the cold shoulder, this was the one that really stood out from the crowd. The fantasy world was believable and the scale was gigantic. Everything from the story right through to the musical scare eclipsed everything else on the Wii. The saddest part though is that it launched towards the end of the console's life, so few people really experienced this game that pushed old tech to look all shiny and new. Just look at it. I mean, it looks fantastic. Just look at this. This is a Wii game. Honorable mentions: Super Mario Galaxy 2, Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. The last console to mention is of course the PS3. What game really pushed the shit out of that system? The Last of Us. The Last of Us, I mean, what else can I say? If you haven't played this game, first of all, if you haven't played this game, you're bugging out. Second, look at this. What Naughty Dog did with the PS3 should not have happened. Came out in 2013, so they really took everything the PS3 had to offer and just drained it. They found ways of officially dividing the calculations into little bite-sized chunks. Like, damn, it really pushed the PS3 in more than just one way. Naughty Dog really sucked the crap out of the PS3. They got everything they could out of this thing. Honorable mentions: Uncharted 3, Grand Theft Auto 5. But yeah, those are the games that really push these consoles to their limits. What do you think? I really want to know your opinion though. Let me know in the comments. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, share, subscribe, all that good stuff. It's your boy Aaron. I'll check you later. Peace.